Hello and welcome to the Blue Goat Cyber monthly webinar. What we're going to be talking about today is general FDA cybersecurity compliance, how manufacturers can make sure that they're adhering to the latest guidelines, some common pitfalls that we've seen that lead to additional information notices or refuse to accept letters from the FDA, as well as a proven process on ensuring that FDA cybersecurity is met the first time around without any major delays that can lead to cost overruns, time overruns, or other problems. All right, we can go ahead and get right into it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is just generally what is required for FDA cybersecurity. So in September of 2023, the FDA published final guidance titled Cybersecurity in Medical Devices, Quality System Considerations and Content of Pre-Market Submissions. What this guidance is doing is essentially trying to establish a baseline for cybersecurity in medical devices. More and more devices are considered cyber devices, and we can talk a little bit about what a cyber device is in a minute here. This guidance is a massive increase in requirements for cybersecurity on software-enabled medical devices. Before, the requirements were fairly thin. A lot of manufacturers were able to get by with minimal documentation and minimal testing. This is no longer the case. Now, manufacturers take on a major burden in ensuring that their devices are safe and secure. Now, notably, there is the intersection of safety and security here within the medical industry. Of course, we're dealing with patient safety, patient information, a lot of changing factors that may not be applicable to other industries, such as finance or general just IT systems. Usually those are more focused purely on security. When we're looking in this medical space, there's a very tight blend of safety and security, which becomes apparent going through some of the specific parts of FDA regulation. So, why can we not leave cybersecurity on the back burner? Why is the FDA so concerned about it, and why are these regulations getting more and more strict as time goes on? As of this year, around 68% of medical devices will be network connected. This leads to a lot of entry points for cyber criminals, and we're going to talk about some of the risks, namely ransomware, that can happen because of these connected systems. But basically what this is doing is just opening up overall hospital networks and healthcare environments to a larger amount of risk. When we have that risk in the system, there can be a lot of things that go wrong, not even just with the device under tests, but with connected systems, with electronic health records, with workstations in a hospital. So if we have a single point of failure, a single weak link in the chain, which could be this medical device, then that's going to lead to a lot of downstream problems. Now, I alluded to ransomware problems before, and what we're really concerned about is acting as an entry point for a ransomware attack. A ransomware attack is non-targeted, meaning it proliferates through a network trying to latch on to anything it can. The first step for a cyber criminal to execute a ransomware attack is to find an initial foothold, an initial weak point that they can attack to try to leverage that weak point and move into a network. This is part of why the FDA is extremely concerned about any of the connected medical devices that could act as that weak point. A study was recently conducted by the University of California, San Diego, on what really are the effects of ransomware. They would look at cardiac arrest rates near hospitals where a ransomware attack happened. Of course, when ransomware happens, it shuts down everything that is connected to the internet in that hospital network. If this happens, a lot of critical care systems will go offline, reimbursement procedures will go offline, and so hospitals effectively can't operate, and they're going to have to move a lot of their patients to other hospitals in the nearby area. This study found that rates of cardiac arrest rose by 80% in the event of a ransomware in the surrounding hospitals, and survival rates were significantly decreased. So it's a major concern to ensure that this does not happen and that hospitals are kept secure and the medical devices within them are kept secure. Now, finally, manufacturers must be compliant with tightening global regulations. Regulatory authorities around the world, not just the FDA, are clamping down on insecure products and really trying to drive safety and security forward. These regulations are similar in Asia, similar in Europe. And of course, while they all have their small nuances, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to make sure that devices are secure, they can't be hacked, and they aren't going to pose unnecessary risk to a patient. Now, we're going to look at some of the requirements for documentation for ESAR. eStar is the FDA's electronic submission template. So it essentially acts as a checklist approach to make sure that every single box is covered and every single potential area of concern has been addressed when it comes to a medical device submission. Now, this is just directed towards the cybersecurity requirements. eStar touches up on a lot of different areas that aren't directly related to cybersecurity. So we'll go over each of these and talk a little bit about what they are. So risk management is a very large part of the FDA submission process, and there are going to be a lot of different artifacts that are prepared as part of this risk management. The first being the report. Report is an overall summary of what happened as a result of our risk management approach, of our risk management framework. We go through the whole process. What do we have left? The next thing that we're looking at is the threat model. So threat models are hypothetical exercises trying to imagine what could go wrong to the device. We're looking at the intended use environment, intended users, the components within the product, any of the parts, interfaces, ports, connections that it has, and saying, what is a potential risk? How can an attacker abuse this functionality? Or maybe if it's poorly designed, how can that be exploited? Again, this is hypothetical. Some of these may be true, some of these maybe not. But what we're doing is we're trying to identify potential weak points and preemptively implement mitigations. Next, we're moving down to our risk assessment. So the risk assessment is essentially scoring realized threats. When we're looking at that threat model, this is the hypothetical side. The risk assessment is the actual side. So we identify what could happen, and then our risk assessment verifies what does happen. This is done through different types of testing, penetration testing, static testing, vulnerability analysis, fuzz testing. The list goes on. There's a very extensive list of different types of cybersecurity testing that the FDA requires, but all of them boil down to the risk assessment. So after we do all this testing, we take our findings, we score them. The FDA is very particular on how they want things scored, and we'll look at that in a little while here as well. The next thing is we want to see a software bill of materials and then some related information around it. Now, the software bill of materials is essentially a log of everything in the device. It talks about all the third-party components, any of the code written by the manufacturer, and then how it all ties together. It also talks about third-party components, different components. And so it's meant to be a comprehensive list of what goes into the device. The reason for that is if one of those components is insecure and has a vulnerability, that vulnerability may make its way into the system and pose a risk. The related information that we need to cover is outside of the software bill of materials itself. So the bill of materials follows the NTIA standard for minimum requirements on an SBOM. And that outlines the list of information that needs to be included in the SBOM, usually talking about things like the component name, the component manufacturer, component version. Some of the additional information that the FDA requires is the level of support. So is it a currently maintained project? What is the published end of life if that's available? Very often won't be available due to the nature of open source projects, but this will be more common with a maintained project, a paid license project. We'll usually have a published end of life date. Finally, the FDA wants to see how you plan to continue supporting this SBOM. So do you have a plan in place? Do you have the infrastructure in place to monitor this and make sure that there's no introduced risk? Next thing that we're going to want to see is the assessment of unresolved anomalies. What this is doing is looking at any software defects in the product, any unexplained behavior, and trying to assess it against the cybersecurity impact. Is there a risk of leaving this anomaly in the system, or is it just going to be an anomaly, unexplained strange behavior? That may be the case where it can be weird or it can be a little bit frustrating, but it's not necessarily something that imposes risk. So that's what we're trying to do. We're assessing anomalies against the same methodology that we're using for the risk assessment to determine if they impose a cybersecurity risk. Moving on, we'll cover the cybersecurity metrics. This is going to vary depending on the type of your submission. If you have a released substantially equivalent device that you have collected previous metrics on, you're providing those metrics. If you have not released a substantially equivalent device, you are creating a plan to capture metrics. And so metrics are capturing vulnerability data, namely, how long does it take for a vulnerability to be remediated? How long does it take to push remediations out into the field? And then just essentially, how are we collecting all of this information about vulnerabilities? So where are we storing it? When are we reviewing it? All of this goes into cybersecurity metrics. The next thing we're looking at is cybersecurity controls. Essentially, what mitigations do you have in place to prevent vulnerabilities or to remediate vulnerabilities in the device? What are cybersecurity design choices? This can also be security requirements that were implemented. Architecture views are essentially what is the device? What does it look like at a global view? What does it look like from an update process? What are any multi-patient harm risks? So what does it look like from that connected view? Cybersecurity testing involves a lot of different components, but essentially it's just a set of test cases and test suites to verify that a device is secure. This input feeds directly into the risk assessment, which feeds directly into the report. Labeling is what information is conveyed to the user. So when we have a product, we have to inform the user of how best to position themselves to reduce their cybersecurity risk and ensure they're using the device in a safe way, as well as any unavoidable risk they must be informed of. The cybersecurity management plan is what is going to happen after the device has been fielded. How do we make sure that it is secure in the future, not just at the time of submission? So what monitoring is in place, and how are we verifying that the device does not have any new vulnerabilities introduced? We're looking at interoperability now. This involves risk assessment, verification, validation, and labeling. Now, this is not required for every device. What the FDA wants to see is that you have a cyber device. It has an interface that connects to something else. That interface is active. It is not only used for service or maintenance, and it is used to make a diagnostic decision based on data. It's not just used for data transfer or format conversion. It is actually making a diagnostic decision. If that criteria is met, then interoperability documentation is required. Now, the core principle that the FDA really wants to enforce is security by design. So devices should be designed with security at the top of mind. It should be the first thing that manufacturers are thinking about as they make design choices. The FDA wants to see a secure product development framework and cybersecurity implemented at the beginning, not bolted on at the end. Bolting on security at the end is typically going to be more expensive, more time consuming, and ineffective. So the controls that are in place are not going to be as effective as if the device had been designed securely the first time around. Now, as part of security by design, we want to talk about risk management approaches. So security risk management standardized for the FDA is AAMI TIR 57. That is based off of ISO 14971, which is safety risk management. They tie into each other pretty closely. They're very similar. However, they're focused on different types of risk. Is there safety, potential harm to the patient, or is there more of a security risk focused on confidentiality, integrity, availability, tampering risks, things like that? Now, they both tie into each other very well, but they should be something that is implemented early on in the process. It can't be done after the device has been designed. Otherwise, they're likely going to reveal a lot of problems with the design of the device that need to be reevaluated. So that's why we typically recommend that these security and safety risk management processes are implemented early. All risk management documentation should be built into that QMS at the inception of the product. So this goes into ISO 13485, which talks about quality standards for a medical device or quality systems for medical devices. The quality system is essentially saying that all the documentation, all the design artifacts, everything is organized in a structured way, and we have ensured quality of a product. Cybersecurity ties very closely into a quality system. Cybersecurity should be thought of as evidence of quality code. So this is a quality product that has been designed in a safe and secure way. Now, as we're going through the development process, this isn't necessarily focused on the risk management, but this is focused on secure development. We want to look at IEC 62304. This talks about how we need to design a device securely depending on its class, what needs to go into the product, and how we make sure that we aren't designing unnecessary risk into it. Now, I want to talk about a few common cybersecurity deficiencies. So when we're looking at cybersecurity deficiencies, this is when the FDA determines that cybersecurity was not done well enough. They either need more information or they're going to refuse to accept the product. Now, based with the implementation of the E-STAR program, refuse to accept notifications are becoming increasingly uncommon, and more often than not, it's going to be a request for additional information. When this is done, you're entered into a review cycle where you have a certain amount of time to respond to the FDA with remediation to any of their problems. Likely one of the more common deficiencies that we see is missing or incomplete threat modeling or threat modeling performed with inadequate methodologies. The FDA talks about what threat modeling frameworks they want to see. They talk about the threat modeling approach that they want to see. If this is not adhered to, it's likely that they're going to push it back for being insufficient, and they will want to see a new threat model done. Another common one is inadequate or absent software bill of materials adhering to NTIA minimum elements. So it's very important that these minimum elements are met. This is the industry standard. This needs to be provided in a industry standard format. So that's going to be Cyclone DX or SPDX. And most importantly, it just needs to be attached all together. Many manufacturers think that they don't need to attach the software bill of materials if they have a simple enough product. Or if they are only using a couple of third-party components, it's not going to be relevant. In general, it's going to be far easier and far less risky to include the software bill of materials, even if you don't believe it to be entirely necessary. There are some very edge case scenarios where you may be able to get away with not providing the software bill of materials. However, these are very rare cases, and it is often much better to simply generate a compliant SBOM and provide it for the FDA. Something else that we see are insufficient risk assessment methodologies. The FDA wants to see objective exploitability factors and consider patient safety when we're looking at the impact. We'll take a look at what that looks like in practice here in a minute, but it's very common for manufacturers to use a probabilistic assessment methodology using words such as probability or likelihood, which are going to be subjective. I may have a different opinion than another assessor, and that is not acceptable. The FDA wants to see that multiple assessors are going to come to the same conclusion based on the same information. Now, a very, very common problem is late cybersecurity integration, and lack of security by design just leads to a fundamentally insecure product. If we start going through our risk analysis and we identify tens of thousands of findings, which seems like a lot, but it does happen, that indicates problems just systemically through the product. What went wrong to allow this many vulnerabilities to work its way into the system? And obviously, remediating 10,000 vulnerabilities is a massive effort compared to remediating 50 or 10. We want to make sure that cybersecurity principles are employed early. We aren't leaving this to the end. We aren't trying to retrofit security into the product. Another common problem, and this leads back into the SBOM, is lack of third-party component level of support or published EOL dates, EOL being end of life. This is not something that comes default in a software bill of materials, and this is a misconception that many manufacturers have some trouble with. They believe that by default, they're preparing an NTIA-compliant SBOM, it's going to have these elements. These are additional elements that the FDA requests. They can be provided directly in the SBOM, or they need to be provided separately. But for each component, we need to track the level of support, whether it's actively maintained, or if it's published and readily available, what is the end of life date. Finally, another very common cybersecurity deficiency is lack of independent third-party penetration testing or insufficient cybersecurity testing. There's a very long list of different cybersecurity testing activities, and the penetration testing needs to be done by an independent third party, and you need to prove that independence. If this is done in-house, it will likely be rejected by the FDA. If we're missing any of these different types of cybersecurity testing, it will also likely be rejected by the FDA. Now, here are a couple of examples of cybersecurity deficiencies. We're missing threat modeling documentation. We're missing a software bill of materials. We're missing vulnerability testing and penetration testing. This bottom one is especially important to look at. We've provided security testing in your submission. However, the testing did not include vulnerability testing and penetration testing. There are a lot of different components, and some manufacturers may believe that they're okay getting away with a certain type of security testing, such as security requirement testing or just static testing. There's a lot more that goes into it. We need to make sure that every type of testing is met and everything is going to be FDA compliance. Now, here are some of the risks of delaying cybersecurity. Outside of the risk of potential rejection from the FDA due to a fundamentally insecure product, there are a lot of other issues. A big one is cost overruns. Retrofitting security is going to be very expensive. Corrective action is always going to be more expensive than preventative action. If we're implementing secure choices towards the beginning, we have secure documentation, we have secure design principles, it's unlikely that we're going to introduce too much risk into the device. If we're trying to retrofit security on at the last minute, it's very likely that we're going to miss something and it's going to be a very costly and time-consuming effort. And leading right into the time problem is delayed time to market. It can often take a year to get through interactive review cycle with the FDA if there are a large amount of deficiencies. This is a year that your product could have been on the market, you could have been selling this device, and instead you're locked up in a regulatory battle with the FDA. We want to make sure that devices are complete on time, no cybersecurity problems are introducing any timeline risks, and the device is getting out of market, and it's getting out of the FDA cycle as quickly as possible. Finally, you may see FDA rejection for mishandled or insufficient documentation. What we're saying when we see mishandled documentation, it may be the fact that we delayed cybersecurity until the last minute. When that happens, it can be a little bit of a rush to try to get everything done, and there's a lot that needs to be done. We need to have a quality system in place. We need to have a lot of other documentation leading out of the software side of things. And if this isn't all organized and sorted correctly, it's likely that the FDA isn't going to have exactly what they need. We may see loss of investor trust due to mismanagement of the regulatory process. Investors are getting more and more keen to cybersecurity concerns. They want to see that devices are secure. They aren't going to introduce any unnecessary risk to their portfolio by facing potential FDA rejection. An investor is going to want to see that you're succeeding. If you don't have enough cybersecurity consideration and design in your device, it's likely that you may not succeed that first time around with your FDA submission. So investors want to make sure that you're handling your security correctly and you're getting through that FDA review process as quickly as possible. Now, if we're waiting to the last minute to try to put on security, fixes can be pretty hard to implement. It may be the case that a certain design choice is just going to be insecure by default, and it's going to take a pretty massive effort to try to remediate it. When this is the case, it may require a redesign of the product and essentially stripping out functionality and replacing it with something new. This is a massive effort and can severely delay the time to market along with the regulatory cycle. It can get stuck in a lot of review process and be very expensive. Now, while we have delayed time to market due to development time pushing it back, this is also lost revenue. There's the opportunity cost. How much could this device have been selling for while it was fielded? If we have that full time where it isn't fielded in that review cycle, like I said, that can take even up to a year. That's a year of lost revenue due to being unable to sell the product due to not being cleared by the FDA. Now, I'm going to get a bit into our 5-phase process. This is what we've identified at Blue Goat as a good cycle to follow. It helps make sure that everything is going to be FDA compliant. We aren't missing on any key areas, and we're touching up on a good flow, working from risk management, working from our quality system, all the way down to our QA, QC, and that final document preparation for the FDA. Now, phase 1 is going to be talking about risk management. So risk management processes and internal SOPs should be developed and implemented early. This is towards the beginning of the concept phase of an idea. We understand what we want to do for our product. How are we going to prepare everything ahead of time? We don't want to start development until we know how we're handling risk. We don't want to start creating documents until we know how to develop our QMS. So this is essentially laying out the groundwork to design a quality product and design a secure product. All these internal SOPs on how to best follow a risk management process based on AAMI TIR 57 for security and ISO 14971 for safety should be developed very early on. These internal processes should align with FDA expectations for the pre-market guidance for any of the relevant guidance documents that are available and be prepared with eStar in mind. Now, one distinction between eStar and some of the regulations or guidance documents is eStar does not need public approval and public review to have new versions pushed out. The FDA can push out new versions whenever they choose, and it changes fairly frequently. So you want to make sure that you're staying up to date with what eStar is looking like and how you're preparing your documentation to be appropriate for the latest version of eStar. Now, when we're looking at risk management in medical context, of course, safety and security blend together when we're looking at what the FDA wants to see. It's going to be different from a lot of other industries, and so we really want to make sure that we have all of our bases covered for the different types of risk management. The next thing that we're looking at is that risk assessment. So when we're in phase 2, we're collecting vulnerability information and potential weak points, and then we score them as per FDA considerations. So when we're collecting these vulnerabilities, this is through our different types of cybersecurity testing. How are we finding the weak points in a system? And then how are we looking at what is really the impact? What can go wrong? How bad of an issue is this? Now, the FDA wants to see patient harm as our primary focus. And so that's essentially saying, if this cybersecurity vulnerability is realized, if an attacker can pull off this attack, what's going to happen to a patient? It may seem unlikely, but we can even go back to that ransomware example that under that study that UCSD conducted. If there is a denial of service, if devices are locked up, it may lead to patient death due to the fact that they can't receive treatment. If devices are mishandled and they can trigger a misdiagnosis, it can lead to dangerous treatments being given to a patient that doesn't need it. Some devices have very strict safety guardrails in place, such as surgical lasers, which are operating at a very high temperature. If these guardrails are removed, it can potentially burn or even kill a patient, especially an autonomous surgical robot, which is operating within a patient. So there's a lot that can go wrong from the patient safety perspective. When we're looking at how does the vulnerability happen, this is where we start talking about exploitability. So the FDA is not going to accept something that uses a probabilistic approach, such as probability or likelihood. They want to see objective assessment methodologies, such as exploitability. And this brings us to CVSS 3.0. So CVSS is a system for scoring vulnerabilities. It takes in many different factors for consideration. However, what we're really concerned about here is looking at the exploitability factors, which are the conditions that must be true. Do we need credentials to pull off this attack? What level of access? Can it be physical? Do I have to have my hands on it? Or can I do it from the other room? Or can I do it from another state? Is it done with over a network, or is it done on an adjacent technology? Is it done through Bluetooth? There are a lot of different things that we need to consider when we're looking at the exploitability factors. And this may change even moving into the post-market phase of the risk assessment. So when we're moving into post-market phase, there may be some new factors that are introduced. How confident are we that this report is valid of a vulnerability? Are there any publicly available exploit codes for it? A lot of stuff can shift as we're moving through the life cycle of a device. Now, another thing I want to talk about is risk tolerance. This is something that should be established during phase 1 and adhered to during phase 2. Typically, we are cautious to accept anything above a low in a medical device. However, some mediums may be accepted. Moving past the medium, however, we have very low tolerance for keeping these in a system. We want to keep devices as secure as possible, and of course, we also want to meet any regulatory scrutiny that we will face with our risk assessment. The next thing is we'll talk about risk controls. So these are either going to be preemptive or retroactive features to increase the security posture of a product. When we're looking at preemptive, usually this will be derived from our threat modeling. So our threat modeling is the hypothetical, what can go wrong? We think this may be possible. We're preemptively going to mitigate it. The retroactive features are going to be from our testing. We've identified an actual realized problem in the product. Now we need to retroactively implement security to increase that security posture and ensure that it's safe. Risk controls should be mapped back to security requirements and tested through V&V. Now, this is another part of security testing that is required by the FDA. They are going to want to see security requirement verification and validation testing. Risk controls should cover the balance of security, safety, and functionality in the product. This is often a little bit of a murky area, as a lot of cybersecurity professionals want to see perfect security. Perfect security is going to be impossible in almost any case. So what we want to see is security that is not going to impact safety or not impact functionality in too much of a way. If we have an easy example for a password field, we typically recommend that you have a sufficiently complicated password. So this is going to be lower and uppercase letters, numbers, special characters, all in a combination, and at least 12 characters. Of course, that is going to be less secure than all of that for 20 characters. However, it's likely going to be very difficult for a user to remember 20 characters. And so then we're running into a risk of them putting a sticky note on the device to try to remember it, or just using something very simple so that they don't have to try to remember a complicated password. And so there's always going to be a level of balance here when we're implementing risk controls. The next thing is we'll look at residual risk and revisions. So if we have any risks where a complete control is not possible, our risk tolerance is going to say whether or not this is acceptable and how we need to document it. If there's any significant risk to the end user or to the patient, that needs to be communicated in the cybersecurity labeling, and residual risk should be captured in our risk management report. We'll have all of this information, and that is essentially what is left in the product. Now, when we identify our risk tolerance, nothing left in the product and all of the vulnerabilities in combination should not be above what we have already determined to be our maximum level of risk. Once we have determined what these residual risks are, we know everything that's going to go into this, we can start finalizing our documentation. So we know what our input is into our risk assessment. We know what new controls are in place for our cybersecurity controls. We know how we can map our traceability from the threat model to the testing, to the risk assessment, to the controls. All of this has to be done once we've determined what is the final level of risk, and now we're at that phase. Documentation can require some new revisions based on these new controls or residual risk, which is why it's important to comb over everything. The documentation should be very carefully reviewed as we're moving into the final stages of the submission, which is where we get into phase 5, quality assurance and control. These final checks can verify that documentation lines up with what the FDA wants to see. Documentation should be structured for E-Star formatting. This is going to streamline the FDA review cycle process. Now, when we're looking at E-Star formatting, like I said before, E-Star can change a lot. We want to make sure that this is structured to the latest version of E-Star, and everything is going to be in the exact way the FDA wants to see it. What this is doing is reducing the risk of someone coming back from the FDA saying, you didn't provide something that you actually did provide, it was just buried in the documentation. We want to validate that the documentation does not need any new changes based on what we've identified in phase 4. So it may be the case that there are a bunch of changing controls, a bunch of changing factors in the risk assessment, and we need to move these changes across all of our documentation. We have to verify that we have it all covered and there isn't anything else we need to add. Now I want to talk about some of the main points that we covered here. Cybersecurity is becoming an increasingly major hurdle for device manufacturers. Early cybersecurity considerations can reduce our time to market and streamline development. Now, what we're talking about here is just the fact that so many manufacturers are getting these additional information notices from the FDA. Cybersecurity is becoming a major problem and is stopping a lot of manufacturers in their tracks. We want to make sure that that is not happening and we're covering all of our bases early. As we're going through that process, our documentation should line up with the structure set by E-Star. Now, it's important to note that E-Star structure and the FDA guidance structure is a little bit different. We recommend you keep it to E-Star due to the fact that E-Star changes more frequently and more dynamically than FDA guidance. Cybersecurity deficiencies from the FDA can lead to major cost overruns and an impacted time to market. Corrective cybersecurity is always going to be more expensive than preventative cybersecurity. This is especially true with medical devices where development can be very costly and redoing development can be even more costly. We want to identify any required policies and procedures very early on in the process, and that's going to work us through this 5-phase process. So anything that we need to do, any procedures, any policies, any SOPs, we need to integrate them into our QMS, any relevant artifacts, and then we're going to start moving through the 5 phases. It's not going to be as effective to try to build things as we go. We want to make sure that we have all the groundwork laid out first. Now, documentation and testing should be performed and reviewed by FDA cybersecurity experts. This information changes a lot. What the FDA wants to see changes very frequently, just due to the nature of how quickly software changes. Everything is AI enabled now, and so seeing how AI changes so fast, even comparing AI a year ago to AI now, it's a completely different landscape. And the regulators are trying to adapt. They're trying to stay dynamic and stay fast. There's a lot of work to stay up to date with everything that is changing, and the regulations that you adhered to last year may not be relevant. Even the regulations that you adhered to 6 months ago may not be relevant. So it's a good idea to make sure that you're working with someone who understands these regulations inside and out and essentially lives and breathes the FDA cybersecurity process. That's going to help streamline your documentation and your testing cycle. All right. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you were able to get something valuable out of the latest Blue Goat webinar.